welcome to this, our first Johannesburg focused, locally focused, regionally focused session of our 17th Annual African Investigative Journalism Conference. We have lined up a wonderful panel this afternoon, which is going to look at the challenges we face in journalism across this region, this subcontinent. I have in Cape Town Adriaan Basson. Good afternoon, Adriaan. Adriaan is the editor of News 24 and himself a long experienced investigative reporter of some standing. I have Thanduxolo Jika, also an investigative journalist of some note at the Sunday Times. Samantha Pilane has joined us from the Ink Center in Botswana, which is the independent investigative journalism center there in Gaborone. She is general manager there. And Immanuel Shinovene from Namibia, from the Namibian, who does, Namibian is a paper that does a good deal of investigative work, and he's a key member of that team. So I'm going to ask each speaker to make some introductory remarks on the topic. Perhaps let's go in the order in which I introduced you. So Adriaan, would you like to kick off?
Thank you very much, Anton and colleagues. It's very nice to see you all, and I really hope we can be together in the same room next year this time. I would gladly start, Anton. Thank you so much. It's always difficult when you talk about challenges and opportunities, because I guess philosophically a challenge is an opportunity as well. So there's some touch points between the sections that I'm going to touch on. So look briefly from the past year doing investigative journalism in South Africa. A theme that just doesn't go away is unfortunately the rogue interception of journalist communication. That is something that has become prevalent again in the past few months in South Africa. Specifically, what we have seen is our crime intelligence unit that is supposed to provide the police with intelligence on crime being planned, on criminal syndicates being used for nefarious purposes, to spy on journalists. At News 24, we had our journalist Jeff Wicks receiving very credible information that his cell phone number was fed into the crime intelligence interceptions system, and that rogue police officers inside that unit wanted to find out who his sources were. As you guys know, this is always about our sources and about the subjects of our investigations, trying to find out who our sources are to silence them. So what we have realized is that it is extremely difficult, as you all know, to find proof that journalists are being spied upon by the intelligence agencies, to find physical proof of that. In the case of Sam Sol, of course, he could prove it, and that case went up to this Constitutional Court a while ago that led to some fundamental changes in our legislation. But in the case of Jeff and Marianne Tam from the Daily Maverick in South Africa, up to now, we have very good sourcing that they are being intercepted. There's investigations ongoing by the police themselves, as well as by the judge for interceptions in South Africa. And even in her report before Parliament a few weeks ago, Judge Basson, who is a retired Constitutional Court judge, she expressed grave concern about the fact that that journalists are being having their conversations intercepted by the intelligence agencies. She again raised the great possibility that journalists' cell phone numbers are not necessarily being registered as a specific project, but that it's being fed into other existing criminal investigations. And that is the way that the rogue police officers manages then to infiltrate our calls. We have taken legal action. We have gotten our lawyers to write to the police crime intelligence unit specifically, also to the police minister and the judge for interceptions. And hopefully this is an issue that will receive much more prominence, specifically from Parliament in the months to come. What was also concerning for me in the past 12 months was to hear our former intelligence minister, Untitled, who was reshuffled but retained in another portfolio recently by President Ramaphosa, admitting that she asked the State Security Agency to intercept the calls of a person who she thought was a criminal, was involved in criminal activity, without any application being made to the judge for interceptions. Under South African law, you have to make an application to that judge to intercept any conversation. Now, Minister Tlodlo was stopped in the tracks by the former head of the State Security Agency, Advocate Maglodi, who's now since been retired, and she's been shifted to another portfolio. But it was quite brash, and I thought extraordinary of a minister to admit that she merely picked up the phone and asked the intelligence agencies to tap someone's phone without the existence of a warrant issued by a judge or a court order. Colleagues, the second issue that unfortunately doesn't go away is media ownership. What we are seeing locally is that that there's increasingly a lack of investment in investigative journalism, specifically at established media houses that are going through a lot of transformation. Only a few dedicated investigations units now exist at places like News 24, Amabungane and the Daily Maverick. But we have not seen the level of investment, the level of appointments and teams existing as we have in the heyday of newsprint. I think this is going to be an issue for a while still as the industry settles itself. On the one hand, you'll have donor funding investigative journalism, as we see in this country and elsewhere. But I am a firm believer that we cannot have donor funding investigative journalism alone. The media houses will have to come to the party and will have to invest in investigative journalism, have to reinvest their profits into sustaining our investigative journalism as we figure out a way for our media businesses going forward. I think there's a risk that investigative journalism becomes a sole function of donor funding. Donors, of course, don't come without strings attached. And I think it's vitally important that the public and the reading public realize the value of supporting investigative journalism as they've done for many years with newspapers. And then also under the topic of media ownership, and I was very glad to see you have a dedicated session in this year's conference on the independent media group in South Africa, is that media groups like that uses investigative journalism almost as a ruse or a front to distribute propaganda for the owner of that media group and a certain faction in the governing party, which I think is another matter of grave concern, and I think one that we should call out much more as journalists. Just two more topics. COVID, I think, has had an immense impact on the work of investigative journalists. Just to mention two aspects, it's been incredibly difficult to meet with sources and to have human interaction over the past year. And I find it when I speak to my colleagues and to contacts is that people are much more or even more scared now or sensitive to meet you in person because of not only the lockdown regulations, but people's real fear of contracting COVID and then having to meet with a mask. I think there's definitely a bit of value in that human interaction that's gone lost since COVID hit our planet. And I think we're going to have to be even smarter and more creative in having safe interactions with sources, increasingly over over ways of technology and not in person. I think we're going to have to increasingly use new ways of encryption, be at the forefront of technology available to investigative journalists globally to make sure we protect our sources when the rogue intelligence agents that I spoke about come looking for them in the normal ways of communication. Also under COVID, I think an opportunity for us and something that we should track very closely is the increasing abuse of emergency measures when governments procure goods under COVID. So I've seen in South Africa and I think elsewhere that it's become high fashion again to use COVID as an excuse not to follow public procurement processes and proper legislation when it comes to tenders and spending public money. And I think that's something we have to watch out for, not only in the medical space, but from all departments. And lastly, Anton, I'd just like to touch briefly on the lack of what I believe scientific and medical knowledge in investigative journalism. I think many of us, and I speak for myself as well, were trained much more in crime reporting, criminal justice, the underworld of money laundering, political, journalism, and not so much in the science and medical field of reporting. I think medical journalism and health journalism and science journalism has been neglected by our investigative journalism fraternity. And I think it's going to be even more important going forward that our investigative journalists, our investigative journalism teams invest in training ourselves to understand pandemics, to understand global warming, to understand how these things will play out in our future, how our government and our private companies and our big polluters, what they are not doing, and how we should report these things in a way that's just as captivating as a good old scoop on corruption or fraud. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much, Adriaan. Some very good and important points there that we will come back to. Thanduxolo, what would you add to that?
Afternoon, everyone. I mean, a lot of this Adriaan has actually touched on. I mean, it's similar experiences to all of us as investigative journalists here in South Africa. But for me, the major one has been, in recent years, the attempt to block access to information, particularly, by government officials, politicians, and state-owned entities. And surprisingly enough, our national treasury has also, been playing part in that, which is, the custodian of our public funds. Previously, I mean, we could request information from national treasury if we were not winning with the different departments. In terms of the contracts awarded, monies spent. But in recent years, they now, cite issues of third-party information, even though one would think that because they are using taxpayers' money, the taxpayers actually should have the right and access to that kind of information. Even in the new dawn, it has still become very much a struggle to get access to information. One of those examples has been what Adriaan alluded to, the use or abuse of emergency funds during COVID. Over the past few months, we've tried departments and gone to Treasury requesting information relating to emergency funds that were used because they run into billions. And still up to date, the National Treasury has been dragging its feet in terms of supplying that information. It is a worrying factor considering how President Cyril Ramaphosa, placed himself or sold himself to the public as that, they are the new dawn, they will be transparent, etc. So it's a bit of a struggle because we also still having to struggle getting information through promotion of access to information. We simply get ignored, and some of our publications do not really have the neck to go all the way to court with each and every PIA application that we make, which is a challenge internally that we face, and also considering the fact that state-owned entities and government, once they realize that they are able to do this thing and get away with it, we don't go all the way to the courts. They just simply, continue doing the same. And then on the other hand, one of the major challenges which I have found over the past few years in newsrooms, and again, I think Adriaan touched on this, investing in investigative journalism. There's generally been, quite a slack in that. In the newsrooms have been really not putting enough resources into investigative journalism. One struggles to even, get young journalists, to train young journalists in newsrooms to be able to do investigative journalism. It is actually seen as time consuming. I still haven't been able to train young journalists to work with, to capacitate them to be able to do investigative journalism. And I think it is going, in years to come, it is going to impact us, because you've got few experienced journalists that are doing investigative journalism currently. And that you see on a year-to-year basis from different newsrooms, from different media houses. We see the same names, that are actually doing these stories. It is a major challenge for me that newsrooms are not particularly paying attention to investigative journalism. They want the fruits of investigative journalism, but they just don't want to put resources in there. And quite correctly so, Daily Maverick, News 24, of course, Amapungane, they have dedicated themselves into investing in investigative journalism. And there needs to be also more funding coming from the media houses themselves to actually do investigative journalism and capacitating their journalists. One last point for me, it's the opportunities in terms of, us as investigative journalists using more data, scraping more data to actually tell stories. One of the examples I can use was the Bosasa story recently, when Agrizi was on the stand at the Zondo Commission talking about the billions that were spent by the state on the same on Bosasa. At that point, I was still at Million Guardian. At that point, we took his testimony and actually went to Treasury to ask for all the payments that were ever made to Bosasa. The data that came was rough. It was a mess. It was huge numbers that we had to sort out. But we managed to get a data scraper, a person who knew how to read the data, clean it up for us. And luckily enough, he was able to also interpret the data. And we were helping with interpreting the data. And we came out with a wonderful story that actually just told of this 12 billion that Bosasa was getting from the state since 20 whatever, since Adriaan was reporting on them in those days. But I feel that there's lack of investment in data journalism, and there's an opportunity in us putting more effort into data scraping.
Thank you very much. You raise a number of points we'll come back to in time. Please, if you have questions, if you're online, then put them in the chat and we will share them with our speakers. If you're in the room in Johannesburg, two of our people, Shireen and Juliana, are there. Please give them your question and they will convey it here to our speakers. Samantha.
Right, thank you, Anton.
As I said, you are from Ink Center in Botswana, so we look forward to hearing your perspective from there.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Anton. As I was listening to Adriaan and Thando speak, I realized that our challenges are more similar. And the Ink Center in Botswana is the only investigative, independent investigative unit in the country, and we are donor funded, by the way. So COVID-19 and its impact has made it in such a way that newspapers now no longer have the ability to hold power to account in terms of using investigative journalism. We found that we find ourselves in a country where newspapers are retrenching because of lack of funding that comes from advertising and other revenue models. And so there's no concerted effort to hold power accountable. And we work under a very hostile environment in such a way that there's no access to information laws. And it's not very easy to get certain information in public offices. We rely on the goodwill of citizens who come to us and say, this is what we have. And but in the past, we have met with some MPs and some policymakers in order to push for reforms, because if we don't have those laws, then it makes our work very, very difficult. And I'm from a very peaceful country, but there's been physical threats against us and breaking-ins at our offices. But we make sure that we have measures in place or barriers to prevent any unauthorized accesses into our offices. And there was at some point during lockdown last year, a smear campaign against the organization and us as individuals on Facebook, and if people don't know how to differentiate what is factual and what is not, they believe everything that these people would say about the organization. And some people straight up bully us online. And we believe that these are people from the government or security forces. And one of our other challenges is the financial challenges. The government remains the biggest advertising spender in our country, but they have in the past limited the advertising with private news outlets. Like I said earlier, that this has seen journalists cutting down on, so this has seen news organizations cutting down on their staff and newsrooms being very, very limited, using very, very limited resources as well. And as a donor-funded investigative unit, we find ourselves having to work more towards making proposals and reporting to donors instead of just doing the actual work. You know, we don't get multi-year funding. So after 6 months, we have to be reporting doing some very huge reports. And after the funding ends, we find ourselves having to apply again to other funders also. So this has made our organization to have unstable resources, and this also results in the poor remuneration of reporters or journalists, not only in our organization, but everywhere else. And to carry out an investigative story is very, very expensive. If you remember the Musu story that we did in 2018, you'd find out would spend about $5,000 US just to purchase a satellite image. And a lot of this makes it very, very difficult to work even on more stories because of financial challenges. And when you look at organizations like Amabungani, in which they get a lot of donations from members of the public, that's not the case in my country. The spirit of philanthropy in Botswana is, well, there's no spirit of philanthropy in my country. And also, even if there was a spirit of philanthropy, I mean, we're a population of 2.1 million. So you might find out that the people who are donating to us, these are the very same people that we want to investigate tomorrow. And then this brings us to like some conflict of interest. And yes, even though we want the wealthy to be interested in supporting public interest journalism, that is not the case. So this makes us to be reliant on international donors. But international donors also look into the region and say, Botswana is a middle income country. So they'd rather be putting their fundings elsewhere than in the country where, which is lauded as the jewel of democracy in Africa. So in that way, our center is not really stable as a result because of lack of reliable funding. And this makes our job to hold power to account very, very challenging. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Emmanuel, a Namibian perspective.
Yeah, it was really interesting from the previous presentations. One of the things that I probably want to highlight is the issue of considering the points that have been raised by the previous three speakers. I think several things stand out. Just a brief background on the point I'm going to make. In Namibia, the Namibian newspaper is probably the only freely privately owned news organization that is not even owned by any private interest. That means we are mostly run based on what the print papers we sell and the other income, and no private interest at all, which makes us our case unique. And this is where we have an investigative unit within the newspaper. So the setup is like how Amabungane was within the Mail and Guardian, even though in this case the Namibian is not owned by any private individual. But I think with us we have, I think, probably a good story to tell in terms of the challenges and how we managed to get around them. Because probably because of our role in Namibia's independence, and after independence, we were mostly funded as an organization that was fighting against apartheid. So then after independence, there were no donors. So we say now we are on our own, but after that, we still remain steadfast. But like, for instance, we had really good success stories with in collaboration with other colleagues across the continent. For instance, 2 years ago, we collaborated with what is called the Kishore Scandal. The Kishore Scandal is basically a corruption scandal that involved ministers who took bribes close to of fish worth at least 2.5 billion. And after we wrote that story, we collaborated with Al Jazeera, and other people in Norway and Iceland. And after the story was written in 2019, up to 2 ministers were arrested and they are still in jail now. And several other businessmen are still in jail. But I think that points to the issue I want to probably raise is, as African investigative reporters, we should probably try and work together more. The main challenge is I think everyone is within their office trying to do an investigation on their own. But I think it has been proven ever since the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, the Gupta leaks, which involve the several news organizations. It was more collaborative work. But in the African continent, I have not really seen a good example of, let's say, 10 African organizations teaming up to cover issues robustly and then saying, okay, this is what we want to get, even if it's, for instance, about the pandemic or the issue of environment. We lack that. So I think before we even get to the issue of just covering corruption, how about we clean our own house and work together in coming up with delivery projects? At the moment, the Namibian is part of a consortium of investigative centers. It's known as IJ Hub. IJ Hub is basically a home to several investigative centers in Swaziland, in Namibia, in Botswana, in Malawi, in Zambia, in South Africa, with Mabungane. So we pull resources together. We will try and probably get to that goal of having more African countries working together. But ideally, we want it to be only to African, Southern African countries. We want at least collaborative work of reporters working on stories in other countries. I think one of the challenges really that at the moment, for instance, there are organizations that are probably trying, like OCCRP has been trying to at least bring together centers across the continent. But we need, I think, a deliberate, continental-driven, collaborative work like what ICIJ does. With ICIJ, we often have long-term project, 18 months or so, but we should probably also work on that to say, look, we are going to have a collaborative with News 24, and then focus on issues that I think would really have an impact, instead of, there's a brilliant story about judges in Malawi or in Zambia, and then boom, that case died. While, or there's a story about timber in Zambia, and then one that process probably leads to a lot of countries, including Namibia, Angola, and all the others. So that's probably one of the issues that I'll probably suggest in terms of the challenges we have.
Thank you. That's an extremely interesting suggestion. And hopefully this conference is a place where we can discuss such collaboration and the possibilities for.
I have a question
I have a question from radiation into the South African lottery and the looting that went on there. He and members of his family became the subject of ongoing smears and defamatory lies on social media, on radio and television, and in print. He said, I have always believed that journalists should not litigate, but I'd be interested to know how others deal with this and what their view of it is. Thanduxolo, would you like to kick off?
Thanks, Anton. I actually recall what was happening to Raymond, but I think the time has actually come, that we do in fact litigate, because if you don't, it just continues and it's repeated, unabated, and with social media now. People take things as facts on social media, and it remains, and you are labeled as that, journalist that is attached to a certain political faction, etc., etc. I'm talking in terms of what I do. You know, there's constantly, you know, that labeling. You are, what is it called? WMC. You know, you're a journalist of white monopoly capital. You are used by whites, etc., etc. You know, it does do quite a lot of damage, and I do think, you know, we do have to now take those kind of steps and actually do litigate and just not let it go.
How do you, Immanuel, deal? Do you get a lot of abuse on social media when you do stories, and how do you manage it?
Yeah, I think it's one of the serious issues we have is probably cyberbullying. But I think we probably, as journalists, we try and let it slide by having thick skin. But I guess it's probably one of the reasons as well that we don't have a lot of people who stay in the industry, who stay for more years, because just a few you know, cyber bullying things on social media, then they probably give up. But one of the probably the biggest thing that we probably have get as from Namibia's perspective is litigation from private individuals, and we, as the Namibian, we probably, I mean, we take a risk because we are the only independently, you know, news organization that often goes after certain people, and in the reach often, even if you know that you are right, they will still go after you, even you know, in cases where probably even know that, look, we are good at, even we're strong with the story, it will end up like even I think it probably points to the other issue of the judiciary, in terms of our judiciary is probably one of those that doesn't probably appreciate or doesn't give much to a little room for mistakes for reporters, you know. But in that case, I just wanted to point that out, that often reporters should be able to have a little room of, you know, in hindsight, you should have done better, but you should, you know, you're punished. But in countries like ours, no, we win a case here and there, but the lawsuits are literally draining the news media. And for instance, 2 years currently, we are going through a lawsuit of a story we wrote on the Panama Papers. You know, as the organization, the private organization has been holding on for years, but things like that could, you know, it's really bad for private media.
Samantha?
Yeah, we often ignore these abuses that come with the TAF. We believe they come with the TAF, and we let the stories that we do the talking. But I personally, I strongly believe that, yes, we should litigate, but where will we get the funds and the time? That's one of the things that really pushes back from being litigious, you know. So we just concentrate on the work and hope that these people that are attacking us will run out of stamina. But some things are really, really hurtful, yes, and they should be litigated against, but it comes with the TAF, like Shino has said, you need to develop a thick skin, yeah.
Thank you. I have a question here from Zama Kumalo, I think it is, from Johannesburg. It says, I want to ask or pose a question on the issue of the rise in digital technology killing newspapers. Do we have a future as journalists moving forward, or should we just change our career and look somewhere else? Zama is from something called 013 News in Mpumalanga, looking for some career advice. Let's switch orders. What would you recommend, Samantha?
I wouldn't say we should switch careers with the rise of digital platforms. I still believe that the work that we do is very, very important. Without it, democracies will die for sure. And we just have to adapt and be innovative. That's what I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I would absolutely support you in saying just the opposite, that we might be squeezed now because of immediate financial pressures. But journalism, investigative journalism, is more important than ever. And Adriaan, I'm neglecting you in Cape Town. Is there anything you would like to add at this stage?
We used to being neglected here in Cape Town, Anton.
You're muted, Adriaan.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello? Samantha, can you hear me? I see you moving.
We can hear you now.
Okay. Maybe Anton
we can hear you.
had a problem. Okay, so I'm just look. I think that indeed, that it's actually a golden time. I do, Zama, understand that local newspapers are going through a very tough financial time, and I'm really sorry for what you guys are going through. Local investigative journalism is incredibly important. We cannot, from the main cities, investigate all those stories that should be investigated in small towns, courtrooms, clinics, etc. We're going to have to find a model where maybe we can help you guys with exposure of your stories, but get a model going where local journalists, we want to do investigative journalism in rural areas, in towns, outside of the cities, where you have a future. And I do think digital gives you opportunities. I don't think it takes away opportunities. It gives you easier ways to publish and to find exposure for your work. So let's work together on a model where we can give exposure to this work. I think an organization like Ground Up has got a great model. And I think that's something we may want to look at how they're doing it.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear how we have cases of commercially successful publications like the Namibian being able to sustain its own investigative journalism. Others more dependent on funding. In South Africa, it's a mix. There's some self-sustaining and there's some funded, and they both play important roles, I would say. Adriaan, you mentioned giving exposure to the stories of others, and you do that sometimes, as others do, like Daily Maverick, to operations like Ground Up. But Immanuel was talking about the need for greater collaboration across the subcontinent and further. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think we are very insular often in our investigations. There's so much corruption in our own country that we sometimes forget that corruption doesn't end with the border. It obviously goes over the border. In fact, I would love to work with Samantha and Immanuel on some investigative stories. There's been some serious South Africans doing bad things in both those countries. No, I think we must do it, Anton. I think we must just do it. Actually, not wait for a body or a meeting or a organization, but just maybe on individual level cooperate. The nature of money laundering and criminal syndicates, it doesn't know borders. It doesn't limit itself to a geographical area. So I absolutely do think there's need for more of that, and I'm very happy to participate.
Thank you. Thanduxolo spoke about the lack of time and space and resources to do essential training of young people. And I think that's a very important point. I wonder, I mean, Adriaan, you're an editor-in-chief, but so I'm not going to ask you, but I'm going to ask others whether editors see the level of skill and training that's often needed for really good investigative journalism these days. Is it recognized? I fear it isn't.
Adriaan, Anton, it's been a sort of pet project of mine. I've seen that not much is actually done in the newsrooms that I've been in, to capacitate young journalists to be able to do investigative journalism. And then you find young journalists being frustrated with the type of work they're doing because, they feel that they just fill in, pages here and there. There needs to be more of that being done. An example in the past few years that I have seen is the struggle when editors are actually looking for journalists to do serious investigative work, they struggle finding journalists. And I recall, at some point, if we can pinpoint a newsroom that actually does focus on young journalists, you find it's mostly Daily Dispatch in the Eastern Cape that's got more young reporters that do get more space and time to actually do investigative journalism. I think the idea or the pressures of deadlines of actually getting big stories has led to newsrooms neglecting actually training younger journalists to be capacitated to do investigative journalism. There's not much patience for young journalists. And also, I saw that at Mail and Guardian, they did push young journalists to do investigative journalism, putting them in the forefront, pairing them with experienced journalists like myself and others. There needs to be more of that, I think, in my view.
Would other panelists like to add anything?
Oh yeah, I'll just pick back on what Thando said, that editors are too busy running after, busy with stories and finding ways for their publications to survive than to care about training up and coming journalists. But with us at Inc., since our inception, we've been training more, we've trained more reporters than any other organization in the country, in fact. And currently we have 2 young reporters that are being trained in-house. And we strongly believe in training and growing another generation of investigative reporters, And we believe that for change to happen, we need more and more investigative reporters, truth be told. Yes.
Very good. We're reaching the end of our session. I wonder if you each just want to make a couple of closing remarks, perhaps picking up on things said by your other panelists here. Let's shift the order. And Samantha, would you care to go again? Just make some closing thoughts on what people need to take away from the session.
Okay. Like Shino said, we need more collaborations. We need a concerted, homegrown effort in investigative journalism, and in that way we can make a great impact. And I believe that we should not be deterred, even though we face a lot of challenges. We should not be deterred. We should keep our heads high and continue illuminating light into these dark places, and for not only for us but for future generations as well. We need to keep marching, really. Thank you.
Thanduxolo?
On my side, the issue of collaboration, more collaboration in terms of us as African journalists, I find it very important. We know that there's relations between those with money, our politicians, with a number of SADC countries. We know of Angola, Mozambique, where there's claims of monies moving from here to those countries, and Botswana as well. So those are important. And also, again, the last one, investing more in investigative journalism and training young journalists. That's it. Thanks, guys.
Immanuel.
Yeah, from our side, after listening to this conversation, I think the future is bright. With all the challenges that we have, I know, for instance, that when we started the Namibian 10 years ago, the whole point in Namibia was investigating reporting did not exist at all. But now I think we are even at the point where we are providing a lot of investigative stories than before. But I think this just reminds us that we should keep going, and to those who are starting to still keep going, to ask assistance. I think if Adriaan, for instance, picks up something in South Africa, he can share with me, or with other colleagues that are in Namibia or Zambia. I think this week, the digital era has given us really a chance to continue telling investigative stories at a much more larger scale, to an extent that I think we could do much more better than what could be done 30 years ago. Because of the technology, now we can communicate faster, we can share documents faster, so there's really no excuse not to do at least better than what our past previous investigative reporters have done. So I think it's really, the future is bright. We should keep pushing.
Thank you very much. Adriaan?
Yeah, I think Samantha summed it up well. We still have the best jobs in the world. It's no time to give up now. We should be energetic about this job. It's an important time for investigative journalism. I was greatly enthused that the Nobel Peace Prize went to 2 journalists this year. This is an important time for us to stand up, speak out, use digital platforms to our advantage, and keep on knocking on your boss's doors, guys, and ask for more resources and investment in investigative journalism. It's not only important for democracy, but it's also good for business, and there's a way to convince your bosses about it, I am sure. So good luck to everyone, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much, and thank you to this panel. It's really highlighted both challenges and opportunities. It's interesting how lively the area is, but also we see that issues have been highlighted which really need attention. Financial resource issues sounds pretty fundamental, but there are also concerns about issues like surveillance and security. So thank you very much to our panel. We have a very interesting next plenary session coming up in a little while, and a conversation about race and journalism with 2 of our American colleagues who are at the center of that debate in America. So I hope that we'll see you shortly in a plenary session, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.